Hello everyone, my name is Liz Gillis and I am delighted to have been asked back to do a lecture by County Library about the Irish Revolution. Now this talk in particular is going to look at the effects of the conflict on women and children during the Irish Revolution, with a particular focus on Wexford. And the Irish Revolution, the narrative has been dominated by big names, famous events, and so on. But during the course of my research, I'm discovering so many amazing stories that involve just ordinary people that were living through this extraordinary time, trying to get on with their everyday business, and were caught up in what was going on. There's some sad stories, there's a lot of sad stories. There are some light moments as well, and hopefully we're going to touch on a bit of everything with this talk. But to begin with, there is one family that jump out when it comes to Wexford and their involvement in the Irish Revolution. And that is, of course, the Ryans of Tom Kill. So they were up to their necks in it right from the very beginning. You have the sisters Min, Nell, Mary Kay, Agnes, and Phyllis all being involved in Cumann. Phyllis, she was the youngest sister and she was the last to join. She actually waited until she graduated from college before she joined Cumann. Didn't stop her taking part in 1916. You have their brother Jim Ryan, and he's involved. He's a member of the Irish Volunteers, came from a nationalist family. And one thing that was really important at this time, if families could afford to do so, you find that they would send their daughters to university. Education was opened up to women. University, third level education had been opened up to women at this point, and where those who could take advantage of it for their children, they did, and the Ryans are just one example of that. And the girls, they travelled all over Europe. They became teachers, languages, science, and so on. But they're radical in that respect, but also in their politics as well. So, as I mentioned, they became members of Cumann. You had some sisters staying down in Wexford, and also you had the others then in Dublin. Now, when it came to 1916, you have Min Ryan, and she was delivering dispatches prior to the rising. You had Phyllis and Min actually ending up in the GPO in Dublin's O'Connell Street, fighting alongside or being with her brother Jim in the GPO. He at that time was the chief medical officer of the Irish Volunteers in the GPO, and he would have looked after Connolly after he was shot on the Thursday of Easter week. Not very much that Jim Ryan could do for him. The wound was so bad. James Connolly's leg he'd been shot in the leg, and the wound got gangrenous, but it fell to Jim Ryan to look after him, make him as comfortable as possible. Now, after the rising, you have two of the sisters being arrested, and that was Nell and Mary Kay. Now, Mary Kay actually wasn't involved in the rising in Wexford. Nell, she was out, she was involved, and she was seen to be one of the more dangerous women that was involved, because although 77 women were imprisoned after the 1916 rising, 12 of them, including Countess Margaret, were deported to England, and Nell was one of those 12 women. Jim, after the surrender, he was interned in Frongach, and he was released with the majority of prisoners in December 1916. Now, like all of those who were deported and those who had taken part in 1916, the Ireland that they left or that they witnessed, it was quite hostile to the volunteers, to members of Cumann. The people didn't generally support the rising. Not that they didn't support the idea of a free Ireland, it's just with the First World War going on, there was much bigger things happening, much more important things, and it was felt that the timing was wrong. But by the time Jim and his comrades were released in December 1916, they came home to a very, very different Ireland. They were welcomed home, and that continued into 1917 when the other prisoners were released, those who had been sentenced. Now, for those, the Ryans that hadn't been in prison after 1916, for example, Min, they hit the ground running after the rising. They were busy trying to rally support, and Min was one of a number of women that was sent over to America after the rising to meet with the members of the Clan of Gael who had helped fund the rebellion, but also to tell the American public what had actually happened. So you have all of these women. Margaret Skinner was another one taken part in these lecture tours all across America. And Min Ryan, she's one of those women that does that. So we know that there were combatants from Wexford in 1916. And of course, Enniscorthy is hugely involved in the rising itself. But the civilians that were affected, we hear of people being killed in 1916, but people were affected in so many other ways. Their property was destroyed. If you're anywhere near O'Connell Street, pretty much your home, your business most likely was destroyed, but also business had been looted and so on. But you have these compensation claims. Now, these are an absolute treasure trove of information. They're on record in the National Archives in Dublin. They're all online. So just Google 1916 compensation claims and it will bring you to the site. They are absolutely fantastic. Now, you can search by location, you can search by name, and the amount of claims put in by people from Wexford, either relating to something that happened in Wexford during 1916 or people that were in Dublin at the time, but were from Wexford. So I'm just going to touch on a few of them. And what they were claiming for was everything and anything. So here we have Miss Mary Sweetman. Now, she was from Ballinasstraw in Wexford, and she was a farmer. She lived on the family farm. Her brother, they had two servants, so they were fairly well-to-do farmers. But during the rising in Wexford, her car, and this is the quote from the actual compensation claim, her car was seized and it was ill-treated by the rebels. Now, the whole car had to get completely overhauled, and she also lost a waterproof rug. She's specifically states that it was a waterproof rug that was damaged or lost, and she put in a claim for £15, 14 shillings and 3 pence, and she actually got the full claim. Now, some people put in extortionate claims, and after the investigations, they either were told, no, you're not getting that, it's too extortionate, and then a compromise was reached. But in this case, Mary Sweetman received the full lot of what she had actually put in for. And then we come to Alice Devereux, and her case is quite interesting because she owned a bicycle shop in Georgia Street in Enniscorthy. And in her claim, she's putting in for bicycles that were stolen, both new and secondhand, men's bikes and women's bikes. And she put in a compensation claim for over £72, I think, but in the end, she ended up getting £50. So that's okay. And she actually lists all the bicycles, that the makes and so on, that were stolen. Some were actually recovered after the rising. However, our husband also put in a claim, and he put in a claim for £100. Now, the thing was, the investigators thought that this was a little bit extortionate. There had been 2 claims put in, but when they began to investigate George, they discovered that he had a brother, Eugene, and there was a bit of discrepancy as to whether Eugene was in partnership with George in the bicycle shop. But more importantly, and sort of pushing the authorities not to pay out the compensation claim to George, was that Eugene was a rebel. He was actually involved in the rising. So here you have a husband and wife who are putting in claims for bicycles that were stolen by the rebels during 1916, and George's brother is actually one of the rebels involved. Now, they couldn't find the connection to link Eugene as a partner to George in the bicycle shop, so he actually did get a claim. Didn't get the £100, but he got £76 in compensation from it. But it is amazing. This story just shows you how close the connections were and how complicated Irish history is, because families were, all caught up in this. And here you have a chap putting in compensation to the government, and his brother is actually involved in the rebellion that he's claiming the compensation for. And then we have Miss Eveline Constance Goulding, and she put in a claim for 2 trunks that were damaged. And again, to quote from the claim, rifled through by the rebels. So although she was from Kilran in Wexford, she was in Dublin. She was staying in the Alexandra Club, which is on Stephen's Green at the time. And there was jewellery and personal property that was either stolen, as she says, by the rebels, and the trunks were damaged. But just to show you, this is the type of stuff that was the level of detail that was put on these claims. So here we have just half of the list of what Evelyn was claiming for. So just an example of what she carried around with her when she was going away. But for example, she has diamond cluster ring, she has an emerald and diamond ring, there's an Indian gold brooch, there's a ring with a red stone, a floral shamrock brooch, a long gold watch chain, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, she received £72 in compensation for what was lost to her. And then we have Miss Maud Downe, and she claimed for a gun that was stolen, a Colt, a 6-chamber Colt revolver that the rebels stole. And she actually got the £4 in compensation. She got the full lot. And you can see from the address here that she lived in 6 St. John's Terrace in Enniscorthy. And I'm telling you, you can spend a whole night looking at these compensation claims. Just go to W, click on Wexford, and you'll just see everything to do with Wexford comes up in these compensation claims. They are so worth having a look at. But these are an underused resource in relation to 1916, but here you're getting the ordinary person's perspective of how they were affected. The people didn't just die, the civilians didn't just die in 1916, they were affected in so many other ways, and you get an idea of how they were affected through the compensation claims. And a lot of them, there are a lot of women making claims at that time. Now, after the Rising, I touched on it that Min Ryan, the Ryan family are going to sort of be a thread throughout this talk because they are involved literally in everything. So as I said, Min Ryan, she is one of the women that goes to America after 1916, but Min has such a connection with the story of the Easter Rising because in fact at the time she was Sean McDermott's sweetheart. Sean McDermott, signatory of the proclamation, and of course executed on the 12th of May 1916. The last 2 men to be executed were McDermott and James Connolly in Cumann. And if you haven't seen it, I would totally recommend it. The RTE Daily Archives website, they have a 1916 exhibition online, and it consists of all interviews that were done in the 1960s with participants and witnesses. You've got civilians, rebels, there's British soldiers and so on. But you'd have an interview with Min Ryan. It's a full interview with Min about what she did in 1916. And it is so poignant when she comes to talk about her meeting Sean McDermott for the last time in his cell in Cumann just a few hours before he was executed. And she went there with Phyllis, our younger sister. And she talks about how he cut off the buttons and he gave them to her, told him who to give it to, his friends and acquaintances and so on. And the way she's talking throughout the interview about him is like that they were friends. They're nothing more than friends. But the interviewer asks, but did he give you anything? And this is near the end of the interview. And she just says, oh, he gave me this ring. And she's wearing the ring and she just touches it. And it's like this interview was done nearly 50 years after the Rising, 50 years after that event. And you just know by that one action, by looking at that ring, she was back in 1916 saying goodbye to McDermott, who was more than just a friend. As he himself said, if he had lived, she would have been his wife. Now, after she returned to Ireland from America, like all the other women, she threw herself into the Republican movement. The whole the volunteers coming on, they were all reorganizing. As I said, Ireland had changed. There was a grassroots support for the Republican movement, and that just grows and grows throughout 1917 and 1918, especially with the general election. It's a turning point at that time. But Min herself, she went on to marry Richard Mulcahy, who was rising through the ranks very quickly of the Irish Volunteers. He had himself been out in 1916 and knew McDermott and so on. Richard Mulcahy and Michael Collins, of course, become the 2 key players, key figures in the IRA in Dublin. They're members of the General Headquarters staff. They're pretty much trying to direct operations in Dublin. And he is really one of the most wanted men in Dublin at the time, alongside Collins. So although they were married in 1919, like so many volunteers and Cumann who did get married around that time, they didn't enjoy, the sort of excitement of being newlyweds, because Richard pretty much had to go on the run very soon after they got married. Min was left with a young family. I think she had at least 2 children by the end of the War of Independence. But it got so bad, as in the raids on her house in Dublin were so bad, constantly being raided by the authorities, by the police, by the military, looking for Richard, that she had to leave her home in Dublin and she moved to Belfast to be with her sister Agnes, who herself had married Dennis McCulloch, another Republican. He'd actually been one of the men that was responsible for rejuvenating the IRB back in 1908, 1909. And there she's gone from the frying pan into the fire with moving up to Belfast, because things were really kicking off. The violence, the pogroms were kicking off in Belfast at that time. And not only were Min and Agnes married to Republicans, you also then have Mary Kate being married to Sean T. O'Kelly. She married him in 1919. So he was off in Paris trying to be part of the Republican delegation, trying to get admittance into the Paris Peace Conference, where the newly freed countries were putting forth their case to get independence, and Poland and so on. And whereas they did get, admitted into the Paris Peace Conference and their cases heard, Ireland, because Ireland was ruled by Britain at the time, they were ignored. But Mary Kate, she spoke so many languages, so she in turn does a lot of sort of consulate work for the Dáil while she's abroad with her husband Sean T. So you can see that despite being married, despite having, normal things to get on with, they were still being very, very, very revolutionary in their activities. Now, the War of Independence began in January 1919 and it ends in 1921 July, but the first year of the conflict is dominated by the volunteers raiding for arms, because this was a volunteer army. They didn't have weapons, and they had to secretly buy them, or in most cases, steal them. And the RAC barracks around the country were the initial targets, but also private homes. And the volunteers would find out where guns were hidden or who was holding guns, and they would also be targeted for raids. Now, in February 1920, we have this event where volunteers, members of the Enniscorthy IRA, were ordered to raid a number of houses in Wexford. And it went terribly wrong. We have the shooting, the killing of Mrs. Ellen Morris in her home on the night of the 14th of February 1920. Now, 1919 was bad, but 1920 is like the worst year of the conflict. You have the arrival of Black and Tans, the auxiliaries, the assassinations increase, the ambushes increase, and it just gets worse. And unfortunately, civilians do get caught up in all of this. But in the case of this raid, what happened? So you had a number of volunteers from about 3:30 on that day, the 14th of February. They began to meet and so on, and they had been ordered to go to a number of houses to raid farms to get the guns out of those private dwellings. And they went to the house of Mrs. Morris. Her husband was there as well. Ellen was the mother of 13 children. She was 61 years of age when she was killed. But we have accounts by those who were there. We actually have an account, the confession of the man who shot her, because they were arrested pretty quickly after the event happened, the shooting occurred. And it was John Lacey. And the police rounded him up, and I think it was 12 or 13 other volunteers, and they're all named in the newspapers. Like, this was emblazoned across the newspapers. All the newspapers, it seems, were carrying this story, and it went on for quite a long time, the story. But according to John Lacey, what happened, that they went in to the house, and one volunteer, I think it was a volunteer called Leary, he accosted Mr. Morris, so Ellen's husband, and he was held. And John Lacey then went to Mrs. Morris and told her to put her hands up. Now, from what I've read in newspapers, she was a feisty woman and she wouldn't give up. She wouldn't give up easily, and that's exactly what she did, because she refused to put up her hands. Now, she ran because John Lacey, he basically set the gun off. He shot towards the ceiling, and she saw it as a chance to run, but not to run out of the house. She ran and grabbed a spade and swung at him. So as I said, feisty woman. She was not going to, let these men just come in and do this. Now, what happens next, according to Lacey, was that he had never held a gun before. It was first time using firearms. He does know how it happened, but the gun was in his hand, and all of a sudden it went off, and Mrs. Morris was shot dead. They then left the house. They refused, and there is some issue here because the priest wasn't allowed to go to her. Some volunteers were told to remain in the house, but sadly and tragically, Mrs. Morris died. Now, the court case that followed, it was again huge publicity. All the media were focused on this, and what is surprising, and maybe it's because this is at the start of the conflict, or start of 1920. John Lacey admitted to shooting Mrs. Morris. He gave a full confession. He did name everyone else that was there. They were all rounded up with him, and they were all put on trial. But maybe it was because he pleaded guilty. I don't know, but he was charged with manslaughter. Had been initially charged with murder, but then the charge was dropped to manslaughter. And this is even the time before the Republican courts had been set up. So it was the actual Crown Courts that this trial happened in. But he received 18 months hard labour. Now you fast forward to November or October 1920. So what, 6-7 months later, Kevin Barry, who was executed for shooting a British soldier, it just seems that the sentence that he received, it obviously is much harsher compared to the sentence that John Lacey did receive for shooting a civilian. Kevin Barry, it was a soldier in doing his duty that was shot, but this is a woman who these men came into her home to steal a gun, and she was killed in the process. But 18 months hard labour was the sentence that was given. But here you have fascinating. The newspapers again are amazing resources for discovering these stories and for photographs, because here we actually have photographs of the trial. Like the whole page pretty much dedicated to photographs at the trial. And here we have John Lacey marked with the X. So you see it here, seen the court at Gorey. So the trial was held in Gorey while evidence was being given in the murder charge against 12 young men in connection with the shooting of Mrs. Morris. And here we have John Lacey here. Now, as I said, 1920 is a bad year, and it just gets an awful lot worse with the arrival of the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries and the ramping up of the IRA's campaign. But you then have there are certain characters or certain police that were probably always on the radar of the IRA, and one case in particular, one example is DI Percival Lee Wilson. And in the aftermath of 1916, pretty much the 30th of April 1916, and his behaviour at the Rotunda Hospital, outside Rotunda Hospital, is what marked his cards in terms of the IRA, that if they did ever get a chance to get him, it was going to happen. So here we have Percival Lee Wilson, and he himself was born in England, in Kensington, but he joined the RC in 1909, and he was stationed in Galway. That's where he met his future wife, Marie. Now, Marie Ryan was actually from Charleville, and while he was a Protestant, she was from a Catholic family. And despite the fact of the religious differences, she went against her family's wishes and she married him. Now, he himself served with the Royal Irish Regiment during the First World War, and he was wounded, and he then returned to Ireland. But when he returned to Ireland, it was just prior to the Rising. So around March 1916 is when he returns. And he rejoined the ranks of the RIC. He's a DI, and he's there in Dublin when the rebellion takes place. Now, what he is known for, and we've all seen the film Michael Collins, and he's the character in that film is the one that basically brutalizes Tom Clark after the volunteer surrender. It was him that stripped Tom Clark the actual Percival Lee Wilson was the one who stripped Tom Clark at the steps of the rotunda. You've probably read the descriptions. The nurses were looking out and so on, and made horrible remarks about Clark. The thing was, who witnessed this were men like Michael Collins, were men like Liam Tobin and others. And these, although young men in 1916, were going to be some of the key figures in the War of Independence, because what we have to remember as well with 1916 is that it was a military defeat, but it was only a battle in the war that was to come. So literally his cards are marked. Now, when after 1916, he obviously continues to be involved with the RIC. He gets moved to Gorey. He is the DI in Gorey, and actually he was in charge of the investigation into the shooting of Mrs. Morris. So while his cards are marked by the Dublin volunteers or the Dublin IRA, his cards are also marked with the Wexford volunteers, because he was known for his aggressiveness during raids. If it was raining outside and a raid was going on, he would deliberately keep the people outside while the house was being raided, wouldn't let them get shelter. Really, really aggressive in his pursuance of the IRA. So it's sort of who gets them first in this case. It was the Enniscorthy volunteers and the Dublin volunteers coming together. This operation was sanctioned by GHQ in Dublin. It's sanctioned by Collins, and who was sent down to Gorey to take part in the assassination of Wilson is Liam Tobin, seen here, who was witnessed what he had done to Tom Clark in 1916. And here's Liam Tobin beside Collins and beside Tom Cullen. And Liam Tobin, at this time, the War of Independence, he is Collins's right-hand man in regards to the intelligence department. So you've got Collins, you've got Liam Tobin, and you've got Tom Cullen, and they're like the trinity in terms of the intelligence department in Dublin, driving the assassination war in Dublin. And they succeed in getting Wilson, Percival Wilson, on the 15th of June 1920. He came out of his house in Gorey, stationed in Gorey, comes out of his house. He makes his way to the RIC barracks. He gets a newspaper. He talks to a constable. They walk down the street. He's returning to his home. The other constable moves off. And while he's not too far away from his home, a car pulls up. 6 volunteers are in the car. 5 jump out, and he was shot a number of times. And they drive off, and no one was arrested for the shooting, for the killing of D.I. Wilson. And that is a pure act of revenge for something that happened in 1916. Now, his wife, because although, and this is what we find with the volunteers, whether it's British soldiers, whether it's British intelligence officers, whether it's RIC men, although they signed up for this life, they were, willing to pay the price for their activities, or risk prison, or in some cases death. Their wives didn't necessarily sign up for that life. And when we look at the wife of Lee Wilson, Marie, she was widowed at 23. Like, she got married very, very young. They were married in 1914. But she became a widow, unfortunately, like so many women at that time, at a very young age. They hadn't got any kids. And despite being so young, she never remarried. Now, she was devoutly religious, and obviously his death, it hit her hard. And she just basically devoted her life to his memory, but also finding the strength from somewhere. She did manage to carry on. Now, the thing is, amazingly, for a woman at that time, being the age that she was, she decided to go to Trinity College, and she studied medicine, and she qualified as a paediatrician, and she worked as a paediatric doctor in Harcourt Street Children's Hospital. That's long gone now. But she also never sort of strayed away from her religious devotion. She became very, very close to the Jesuits, and there's a whole story. There's an amazing story with Marie Lee Wilson. but she did always want to remember her husband in some way, and she does that in Gorey when she has the window in commissions, the stained glass window commissioned in his memory in the Church of Ireland parish church in Gorey, and a beautiful Harry Clark window. You can see the vibrant colours and so on, and there of course we have the dedication there, and it was dedicated in December 1922, so 2 years after his death. And it says here, it's the glory of God and an honoured and loving memory of Percival Lee Wilson, DI, RIC, who was killed 15th June 1920, erected by his wife. But her story doesn't end there, because not only does she commission this beautiful window that is it's on display in the church, but then she also gifts the Caravaggio, unknown to her what it was, to the Jesuits in Leeson Street in Dublin, for their support, or the support that they gave her after her husband died, or if her husband was killed, in particular Father Finlay. And she had bought the painting in 1924. It was presumed that it was a copy, and I think she bought it for £20. And then in 1930, she gave it to the Jesuits. And then the painting was discovered in 1990, and it turns out to be Caravaggio's The Taking of Christ, and is now on display in the National Gallery of Ireland. And I suppose what Marie Lee Wilson does sort of show is how women were impacted by the activities of their husband, but she was a strong woman. She did go on and have an amazing career. And when women, not many women were achieving things like that, she is one that breaks the mold and does something and really makes a difference to the life of the future generations. Although they said she was a bit stern, but no doubt she devoted her life to the treatment of children. But her personal loss was that she lost the love of her life. Now, we come back to the Ryans, because where we have that story with Percival Lee Wilson and Marie, you then have a Republican counterpart. And we have the story of Jim and Maureen Cregan. Now, Maureen was from County Kerry, but she was a teacher, moved up to Dublin, and you find that the Gaelic League and GAA were great mixing places for people to mix up similar ideas and interests. And she very quickly got to know the Ryan sisters up in Dublin. So she was always at their house and so on. So was Jim, and they then meet, and then love blossoms. But in 1916, she actually brought weapons and supplies down to the volunteers in Kerry. And then she gets back just towards the end of the Rising. Now, Jim wasn't turned in Frongach, but then he was released, and they, rekindled their relationship, or their relationship evolves. And eventually they did get married in 1919. Now, by the time they got married, Jim is one of the many Sinn Féin candidates that stood in the 1918 election and won. And he won the election for South Wexford, and he and Maureen, they moved down to Wexford. Jim had qualified as a doctor by this stage, and he sets up practice. But a bit like Richard Mulcahy, he's on the radar. He's known he's out in 1916, that he's involved, so he has to go on the run. Despite that, Jim does get arrested in 1920. Now, Maureen had, not only was she only newlywed, but she also had a young baby. The thing was, Maureen herself then became a target for the authorities, because by December 1920, obviously the ambushes are increasing hugely. We have events like Bloody Sunday, November, you have the burning of Cork in December, and so on, the Carmichael ambush. It is really increasing. The tension is ramping up. If the IRA ambush, the military are going to hit back. The Black and Tans or the auxiliaries are going to go on the rampage, burn down creameries, burn down co-ops, burn down villages, and so on. But in this case, there was an ambush in Wexford, and Maureen, because she was known to the authorities, she's one of 6 prominent Republicans that were picked out for sort of treatment by the authorities, in that they were ordered to issue a proclamation by the authorities and put it up in a window or the door of their premises, and she refused. Now, because she refused, she was arrested. And she was put on trial. She was found guilty. She was ordered to pay a fine. She wouldn't recognise the court because that's what the Republicans did. But she was ordered to pay her fine or serve serve some time in prison. She refused to pay the fine. So she just sent me back to prison. And the thing was that the authorities didn't really want to imprison basically a new mother. You know, our baby was literally only, you know, a few months old, and they didn't want to have this bad publicity. But she refused to pay the fine. She wants to go back to prison. They end up not taking her into prison, you know, just kicking her out. But the thing was, now Maureen, it was too dangerous for her to stay in Wexford, so she had to go on the run. She had to go back up to Dublin, leave her life in Wexford. To be honest, although she was a member of Cumann in Wexford, what life had she got down there? Or at least in Dublin, she had support of her family, or her in-laws and so on. So she does move back up to Dublin, and she continues her Republican activities, or work for the Republican movement. So we've sort of seen how wives are affected by the activities of their husbands on both sides, despite the fact that Maureen herself was heavily involved in the Republican movement. But just to bring it back to the civilians, and there's been amazing work done recently in the last, well, over the last number of years by women like Linda Connolly. She's been the driving force in highlighting this, and it's the violence against women. Miriam Colf has done great work on this as well. And there is testimonies in, you know, the witness statements and the newspapers and so on, and I don't hold a candle to Linda or Mary. They are really the experts in this field. But just to touch on it, a witness statement that I found, the volunteer actually mentions having taken part in this violence against women, and here we have it here. And the violence was meted out by the IRA and the Crown Forces, to Republican sympathisers, to Republican activists on the part of the Crown Forces, to just civilian women caught up in events, and then by the IRA against women who are seen to be cavorting with the Crown Forces, the Black and Tans, and that's the example that we have here. And just to read it out to you, Patrick Kelly's witness statements on military archives. What he said was that there was a lady near Gorey who was keeping company with a Black and Tan. She was warned to give up going with him, but she did not do so. One night, with two men in my company, I went to her house and cut off her hair. She did not go with him after that. And you have so many accounts of the hair cutting committed by both sides against women. And again, as I said, I can't hold a candle to this, but look up Linda Connolly, look up Mary McAuliffe, and they've done amazing work. But this is just an example of a woman in Gorey that this actually happened to, for her going out with a Black and Tan. But then the other side of this, because where you have one, you always have the other. We have the activities or the violence against being carried out by the Crown Forces, and not just against women, but against kids. And here we have an example here, and I would recommend looking up the American Commission on Conditions in Ireland 1921. Again, it's online, just Google it there, and it'll come up. It's the full report. So this whole commission was sent over to Ireland to investigate what actually had gone on, what was going on at the time. And you have women like Charlotte Despard and MAUDE and so many others that are meeting with this commission, and they're giving testimonies, and it's like sort of the trials were held, inquests or you know, testimonies were given. And here we have just an example of the type of investigation that they carried out. And this is in relation to, I think, an event that happened in New Ross. Now, I couldn't find it in the newspapers, but people may have heard this story in Wexford, I'm not sure. But this happened on the 8th of September 1920, and it was the shooting of a young girl, Nellie Furlong. Now, according to the witness who was interviewed for the commission, basically she was telling the investigators what actually happened. And just to read out some of the testimony here. So basically she was asked, did she witness this? Did she just hear about it, or did she actually witness it? And she says, I did, sir. The little girl was sent out by her mother. What was her name? Lily Furlong. How old is she? About 8. The little girl did not know about the curfew law. So at this time, curfew had been introduced. And what curfew meant was that nobody, no civilian, no one apart from the military or the police were to be out on the streets after a certain time in the night or before a certain point in the morning. So basically, if you're in the streets at that time, you were liable to be shot or arrested. But what seems to have happened here was that there had been an hour given for curfew, but the authorities changed it and the people didn't know about it. And this is how Lily gets caught up. And basically, her mother sent her out on an errand, and the black and tans called her to stop. She was so scared that she began to run, and they fired. And she was shot in the back. She's been in the infirmary since. Where she's been where in the infirmary. Did you know the murder of the child? I did, sir. How does it happen that the mother did not know there was a curfew law? They were after some boys on the run, but she did not know about that. But why did she not know about the curfew? Could she not read? She could, sir, but the curfew law was usually 10 o'clock. But on this particular night, it was 9, and the mother did not know it. They had put it an hour early because they were after these boys on the run. So there you have a child that is going out to do a grocery run or something for her mum. She comes across these soldiers. That's intimidating as it is. They call her to stop. She panics, she runs, and she was shot. She was shot in the spine. Thankfully, she didn't die. And if that's not bad enough, an 8-year-old child, and unfortunately, I have quite a number of these stories, whether it's the kids getting caught in the crossfire of an ambush being carried out by the IRA, or examples like this. You then have a story of a baby who was being carried by his dad down the street in Wexford, in New Ross, I think it was. And here you have it, roughly stared with babe in arms by black and tans. So we know the reputation of the black and tans and the auxiliaries precedes them, but it's like you sort of can't believe that something like this would happen. It was a baby, but it did. So Mr. Malone was being interviewed. It was him that this actually happened to. And he's asked, what experience have you had with the black and tans? And he said, about 3 nights before I left Ireland, I was saying goodbye to some friends, and it was about 10:30, and I met an officer and some black and tans as I was going home. And he told me to put up my hands. And I said I could not, because I could not lay the baby down. So he is carrying his child in his arms. And he said I must. And I told him I couldn't on account of the baby, but that they could search me. And they did. They tore up my clothes and searched me while I held the baby in my arms. And they got through and didn't find anything. But as you can see, it didn't end there. They weren't happy when I found anything on him and searching him, because now the baby became their focus. As you can see here, it was raining. It was raining very much. I suppose that they searched the baby for firearms. Oh, yes, they did. They opened his clothes and they searched him. Were they gentle and considerate about it? No, sir, they were not. They were very rough, sir. And when they got through, they pushed me into the door. So a child, a literal babe in arms, was getting searched by the authorities. Just to follow on from the story of Lily Furlong, because Mrs. Murphy, who had been given that evidence in relation to Lily Furlong getting shot, she was asked about the little girl who was shot, that child of 8 years old, how badly was she injured? And the mother said she was shot in the spine. It was very serious then. Yes, sir, the mother said she might be injured for life. I would love to know if what did become of Lily Furlong in her life after this. So that was the testimony of Mr. or Mrs. Anna Murphy, who at that time, when she was interviewed by the commission, was living in New York. But that whole evidence, that whole report, is available online, free to download. So they're just some examples of what happened in the War of Independence. Now, tip of the iceberg, but you can see there, it is heartbreak, it is violence, it is terror, and age does not matter. You can see that women and children are caught up in this. But it did come to an end. On the 11th of July 1921, the War of Independence ended. And if ever a photograph sort of sums up the joy of something, that there was the prospect of peace, it is this photograph. And look, it is just the kids. Now, this is taken in Dublin, but you can see the kids are, those two in the front there, so happy. That little fella in particular is beaming and, carrying the tricolours. It's a real sort of moment that it's over. There is peace now. We can move on. But it didn't last long, because what follows from the truce is the treaty negotiations between the Irish delegation and the British government, who had just been the victors in the First World War and had, been involved in the Versailles Treaty and so on. The treaty, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, was signed on the 6th of December 1921. It didn't give the Republic that all of these men and women had fought for, had been imprisoned for, had sacrificed for. The country had been partitioned the year before. By the Irish delegates signed the treaty, they recognised that partition, but also you have the oath of faithfulness that Irish politicians had to take to the British Crown, the British King. So Ireland would become a dominion of the British Empire. The thing was, the Republic was never on the cards, because this is never about Ireland. It's about the Empire and preserving the Empire, because the whole fear was that if one colony leaves the Empire, the others will follow and the empire will go, and pretty much that is what happens within 20 years or so. But that moment on the 11th of July, it's a real moment of hope, of joyfulness, of happiness, and it doesn't last, because within a year you have those who had fought together and had been so close and had sacrificed so much, who were willing to die for each other for the cause, are now killing each other because the Irish Civil War breaks out over the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And it brings us right back to the Ryans of Tom Cule, the family that we started with at the beginning of the presentation. Because we hear of the Civil War always referred to as the War of Brothers. It was brother against brother. It wasn't. Families were completely destroyed. It was husband against wife. And in this case, it was a whole family destroyed. And as you can see, there were so many sisters, there were so many women in this family, and they were completely split on the issue of the treaty. So you have Min Ryan and you have Agnes. They accept the treaty because who they are married to, Richard Mulcahy, who becomes the commander-in-chief of the National Army. He is the person in charge of the National Army, the most powerful person after Michael Collins is killed in August 1922, in charge of the pro-treaty forces. He is her husband. She has 3 young kids, I think, at that stage. You have Agnes being married to Dennis McCullough, who, like Richard Mulcahy, is pro-treaty. But then you have Phyllis, Mary Kay, you have Jim, you have Maureen, Jim's wife, you have all of the other side going anti-treaty. And I was very lucky to interview the daughter of Min Ryan, and there were letters written by some of the sisters to Min telling her to leave her husband. You know, he was a traitor to his country and so on. But what could she do? She's a mother of 2 or 3 young children. What could she do at that time? Plus, he was her husband. She loved him. You have a family being completely ripped apart by the Civil War. And it got so bad that you have Nell, I think it was, that was arrested and imprisoned during the Civil War, went on hunger strike twice. Once because the women were protesting that their post had been stopped and he wants to get it reintroduced. And then she went on hunger strike again. It could be Nell or Mary Kay, I get them mixed up sometimes. And she went on hunger strike again to be released. And you have the sisters putting pressure on Min to talk to Richard Mulcahy, to use his power to get her released, and he wouldn't. He would not do anything to have his sister-in-law released from prison. But thankfully, that family were able to come back from the divide of the Civil War. And you can see from this photograph, this is taken in, between 1945 and 1951, when Phyllis, the youngest sister, the second wife of Sean T. O'Kelly, the second Ryan's sister to marry Sean T. O'Kelly because his first wife had died, in 1934, there they are in the Áras beside the President of Ireland and his First Lady, Phyllis, who is is one of the Ryan sisters. And one positive to come out of it was that their children were not impacted by the divisions that had been caused by the Civil War. But that just is one example of how women were caught up, and the Civil War is not just a war relating to men. Everyone's affected by the Civil War and by those divisions. And just sort of coming to the end, so to bring it back to the kids, we have this story of Alphonsus Bonzi Culleton. And you've probably seen this photograph before. It's taken in what's now Cattlebrew Barracks of Michael Collins. And there you have Fonzie Culleton, the army mascot, marching behind Collins. who pretty much adopted him. Now, Fonzie was actually from Emmet Place in Wexford. And he, by the time the Civil War began, he had been living in Liverpool with his mother and stepfather. But he didn't get on with stepfather, so he just stowed away back to Ireland, came back by himself, and sort of rocks up in Wexford as the Civil War is kicking off. And he was walking down the streets in New Ross, and he sort of got caught up in a gun battle that was going on between the pro and anti-treaty forces, and the pro-treaty soldiers saw him, got him out of harm's way, and obviously discovered that he was here by himself, had known that he could stay with her, so on. So they basically took him back up to Dublin, and that's where he first met Michael Collins, who just took a shine to him. Now, basically, Collins pretty much adopted him. He falsified his age because he was only in 1922, he was only 14 when he met Collins, so he was too young to join the army. So he became an army mascot, and you see him in his army mascot uniform there, and he looks so proud walking behind the commander-in-chief of the National Forces. Like, it's just an amazing photograph. Look at the smile, he's beaming. The thing was that Collins sort of did have an idea that he mightn't survive, he mightn't live to be an old man, and he did leave orders that if anything did happen to him, that Fonzie was to be looked after. Now, of course, that prophecy came true, because Michael Collins was killed in August 1922, so not long after he met Fonzie, after he took him in. He was killed down in Bale-na-Blois. Now, Tom Keogh was the person that Collins had named to look after Fonzie, and he became his second father. And it was Tom Keogh that actually told Fonzie. There was sort of this a discussion on whether Fonzie should be told about Collins's death, and it was Tom Keogh that said no, he has to be told, and he was the one that told him. A month later, Tom Keogh was killed in Cork. In September, a landmine had been laid by the anti-treaty forces, and he himself was killed, and he was only 22 years old at the time. So there you have Fonzie Culleton, who fled a bad environment in Liverpool, ended up in a civil war in Wexford, was taken in by a huge heroic figure that was Michael Collins. He looked after him, he's taken away from him, and the person that is named as his guardian, his second father, he's also taken away from him within a month. Now, despite that loss, Fonzie continued to thrive. He got his education because Collins insisted that he was educated, and provisions were made that he was to complete his education, which he did. He did serve in the army. He did get married, and he moved to America in 1967 with his wife. But it seems that when she died, he joined a religious order, and then he came back to Ireland, and he lived out his days in Clondalkin. But there you have a 14-year-old boy from Wexford just walking down the street, and his whole life changes. But God only knows the loss of not just Collins but Tom Keogh, what that had, the impact that had on him. Now, we sort of touched on so many tragic stories, and unfortunately there is a lot of tragedy in these stories, but we're not going to end with that. We're not going to end with a sad story, because, as I said at the start, there are some light moments. So this is just too sad to end on with Fonzie's story. So we're going to end with this. And here we have a photograph of a church many of you, I'm sure, know, St. Michael's Church in Gorey. And what happened at that church on the 5th of October 1920, it made the newspapers. And we haven't had one really in the story. We've had deaths and we've had tragedy, but we also have a wedding. And despite a revolution being in full swing, despite raids and arrests, a young couple get married, and it did make the newspapers. And this is from the Evening Echo on the 7th of October 1920. And you can see the headline there, "From Police Barrack to Church." I'm just going to read it out here for you. A romantic marriage ceremony was performed in St. Michael's Church, Gorey, on Tuesday, the 5th of October. Mr. Michael McGrath of George Street Gorey, who was an Irish teacher and recently organiser for Cantork, County Cork district, had been arrested the previous evening in connection with a revolver, which the military found under a pillow at the residence of his fiancée, Miss Kate Kinsella. She lived on Market Street, Gorey, and which he admitted was his. He left for the church in a police motor car under escort, where he and Miss Kinsella were joined in matrimony. After the ceremony, the happy pair were motored back to the police barrack, and she, having taken leave of the bridegroom, he was then removed to the cells. Mr. Thomas Kinsella, the father of the bride, is also detained by the police in connection with the above. So despite the fact that there was a full-blown revolution going on, that there were raids and arrests and shootings and ambushes and fires and everything else going on, a young couple who were in love, despite one of them being in custody and his father-in-law being in custody, were given the permission by the authorities to get married. And they didn't spend their early days of marriage together. He was back in prison and she went home. So with that story, I'm going to say thanks a million for listening to me. I hope the talk was enlightening for some of you, and just brought to light some of the lesser well-known stories, but also the really important stories of how ordinary people, ordinary women and kids were affected by this conflict. They have a story to tell, and it is just as important as the stories of the big players. Thanks very much.